It's not just getting married that's an issue. That if the nature of marriage is a commitment to each other in public, then the other thing is, what about divorce? If a couple's in your church and they've had a cultural marriage, they've never legalized it at home affairs, and the husband is beating the wife, then what do we as a church say? Do we consider that a legitimate marriage? Is a divorce required? If it's permissible. I mean, doesn't have to happen, but it's permissible, not required, but permissible. Then how do we deal with that? How do we deal with a wife who can divorce a husband who's beating her or is committing adultery incessantly? Do we say, okay, she can divorce him, but what does a cultural divorce look like?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi everyone, and welcome again to the Theology Alive podcast. We are glad to be back again. We have had a long delay because we've had weeks of different things happening, but we have lined up different videos from our time over at the assembly, and so we hope you've enjoyed them, and we hope to release them sporadically as we move with time. But our episode today is a very interesting one. We're looking to talk around issues of traditional marriage, and we're hoping that this will be an episode in season for many of our listeners. In fact, I know if you're not planning to get married, you know somebody who's had to navigate the idea of, am I married right after I pay lobola, or do I have to have a white wedding to be considered married, and all those sorts of questions. And so today we do have a guest who pastors the church actually up the road from us, but I won't steal his shine. I'll allow him to introduce himself. And so we do trust that this episode is going to be a blessing to you. Like we always say, we'll say it in the beginning, if this is a helpful resource, won't you share with those around you? And it helps us if you comment and interact with us in the comment section to spread the episode far and wide. But also just a thumbs up doesn't really hurt nobody. And so if you could also give us a thumbs up, we would appreciate that. And so our guest today is Alan. Alan, why don't you just introduce yourself to us, just a little bit about who you are. Are you married? What do you do? And anything around just who you are.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Jabu. Appreciate the opportunity, man. Nice to have Isaac with us again as well. That's great, man. Yes, I'm Alan Lester. I'm one of the pastors at Living Hope Church in Hatfield, actually, where our church is called Living Hope Church Sunnyside, but we're in Hatfield.
Oh, wow.
You can tell where we came from.
Yes.
But I have two daughters, Charisse and Hope. The youngest staying in Germany at the moment. The other lives in Pretoria and is working with us in the church. Sure. I'm a biblical counselor. Primarily, my function in the church is doing biblical counseling, and I enjoy that a lot.
Sure.
My wife is living in glory. She doesn't want to be here for the podcast today. She has better things to do.
Sure.
So, I'm grateful for that too.
So maybe just a little bit about your testimony about how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, and then just maybe something about your calling. You sound very specific that your call is clearly as a pastor, but it seems that you have a heart for counseling. Do you want to maybe share with us just the journey that led you to where you are now?
Yeah. Well, I grew up on the mission field with my father as he worked among the Zulus in what's now Mpumalanga, Eastern Transvaal in those days. And, I grew up the average kid, in a missionary home and had a mediocre interest in the gospel.
Sure.
But, as I went through school and left school, I went through military training and became an operational medic and eventually became a paramedic in Johannesburg. I was injured on duty there, and eventually over a period of about 3 years, I fell into a depression, and just my life came to pieces. And the Lord had dealings with me inside of that time of depression. And I picked up a book, Martin Lloyd-Jones, on Romans 1.
Wow.
Began to read, pages of that book, and it was, stuff that I'd never heard before. Obviously had, growing up in a missionary home, but it came to me with a freshness, my hands were sweating, my pulse rate was up, my blood pressure was up, and I just wanted to jump out and tell somebody. But also, significant. My brother became a drug addict, when I was growing up. And for 12 years, he struggled with that. And I saw him go through rehab after rehab after rehab, just trying to find his feet. And eventually it was the gospel that saved him rather than a program.
Sure.
And I saw the power of the gospel in real life problems in that way. So culminating in the time, when God had dealings in my life and brought me to saving faith, I realized that the gospel is the key to solving real life problems.
Wow.
And so since then, man, since 98, I began to study theology, and I haven't been able to stop, just going.
Sure.
I've been doing biblical counseling for 25 years, and I've seen remarkable changes in people's lives throughout that time. Yeah, and then, of course, the third strand is my family life, being married to Charlene, my wife, in 1993. 2 daughters, Sharice and Hope, and both of them have been born again and love the Lord and are serving in the church. Sharice is part of the counseling team with me at Living Hope Church, and she's really doing very well.
So Pastor Alan, I wanted to ask, so what made you go into this big dive and research? I think the shot will show this big book that you've written on African cultural commonalities and counseling. And so what steered you in that direction? Why did you go into that?
Yeah, I think the early years of counseling for me, where I really cut my teeth, was working with addicts. My interest really was with my brother, and his life story. That was pretty dominating in my life. So that was my first interest. And so I worked for 7.5 years as the manager of a rehabilitation center. And I worked, counseling many hours there. But eventually when I came out of that, when we closed that center down and I began to work with people more widely, I ended up working more with sort of white middle class people at the previous church where I was. And I got a certain range of experience there. But eventually planting Living Hope Church in 2009, I realized, man, here I'm speaking to younger sort of university age African people. And so since 2009, my primary counseling has been with African people. And I've realized how much time could have been saved if I'd understood some of the African cultural commonalities. And at that stage, I didn't even know there was such a thing as commonalities. I just thought African cultures are so wide and confusing. There were so many things I didn't understand, even having grown up on the mission field with my dad, And so I thought, there's got to be a way to understand some of the common things that a white biblical counselor might encounter when he speaks to an African person in counseling. How can he have an advantage? How can he say, okay, there might be a following number of possibilities that I'll encounter here, and just to explore some of those to find out, and then be ahead of the game on having thought through those things already. So that was really, it was confusion really, and the desire to save time in helping people that drove me into this research.
So what I mean, the book is close to 1,000-pager, and so I'm not expecting you to remember everything in 1,000 pages. But off the top of your mind, what are some commonalities that you found striking just amongst African people?
Yeah. Well, one of the major findings of this research took me by surprise, is that when I began, my intention was not just to maybe, interview Zulu people or whatever, one ethnic group. And so I thought, I'm just going to interview as many church members from Gauteng evangelical churches as I could who are African people. So I'm looking for Christian people that might come for counseling and who are African. And I say that, Black African, I'm an African, fifth generation, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
But so I thought I'm going to get such a wide range of people. So I ended up interviewing 17 languages Sure. 17 languages from 13 churches.
Mm.
And as I interviewed them, I ended up coming to a point of saturation in my interviews, and I realized I wasn't getting any more.
Wow.
So as I analyzed this data, one of the things that came out was that different, African people from different geographical areas, different languages, different types of experience in life were all telling me that it's going to be almost impossible for you to understand African culture because African culture is so diverse that you're never going to get it all. And then I would say, well, give me an example of a diversity that you believe it's going to be hard for me to understand. And they would explain it. And all of those things that they were telling me ended up filtering down into 4 major commonalities.
Wow.
They're all explaining the same things.
Sure.
And of course, there's diversity in those commonalities, but there were 4 major commonalities that were represented hugely in the data.
Wow.
And the first was the concept of African community. The second was the issue of secrecy.
Wow.
There's a cultural secrecy that certain things that many Africans wouldn't tell somebody else, and then sort of the hierarchy of people, I would tell this person this, but not this person. And then the third thing was the issue of the respect hierarchy. And that's well known.
Yes,
I thought that might be at the top, but it wasn't.
Sure.
And then the fourth major commonality was the issue of marriage. And when I spoke to Charles, had met with him for coffee some time ago, and he said, hey, we want to speak about this at one of the fraternals. So here I am.
Sure.
So that was very interesting, man.
Sure. And it's interesting that you say that because a lot of pastors find themselves in different situations where you have even amongst 2 black people, 2 different cultures, and so there's always the nervousness when they're about to get married. In that there's, I don't know how to do it. There's so much confusion, and maybe to start around the topic of marriage. So we've had this conversation numerous times, and I think maybe to start us off. With the legalities, based on the South African government and what they consider as customary marriage. What must you have done to be considered married under customary law? Because part of the confusion is a lot of people say I've paid lobola and so I'm married. Whereas you hear the people say, well, it's not just lobola. There are other things that are necessary even to be considered a marriage in customary law. So maybe can you just share a little bit for us? When is a person considered married under customary law?
Yeah. So customary law is very wide. You've probably read it inside and out. And as a
thank you for thinking so highly of me.
Of you.
There we go. Okay, well I have, okay.
Yes.
Because I had to to discuss this very issue. And I discovered that how wide customary law is. It's case based. So if it ever ends up in court, we're looking at a whole lot of cases that happened before, and they'll say, oh, well, in a case like this, these people were considered married, so we will consider these people married. But the technical detail is that the customary law allows a cultural marriage, but it must be registered within Home Affairs within a certain number of days. And I can't remember exactly. I think it was 21 days. Or, it's a limited, let's say, a month.
Okay.
It has to be registered. That's the requirement. So we find, one couple that we're counseling at the moment, they've had a customary marriage. They haven't registered with Home Affairs. So therefore, now we don't know. They're living as a married couple.
Sure.
And you say you have to. It's a legal requirement for you to register. So the complication with customary law is that if you don't register, it doesn't mean that your marriage is null and void. So there's this huge gray area.
Sure.
So if you end up in court, they're going to base it on previous cases and say what's reasonable, on an individual case. There's no law that that determines that.
Sure.
That makes it confusing.
It is very, because we also are aware, especially in South Africa, that the idea of fat and sit, where I mean, a lot of our parents never really got married,
Yes.
and just lived together for a long time. But in reality, if at any point, we're talking years of just living together, 10 plus years, and I was hearing even it coming up in the news that if at any point, one of them had to leave, one of them could actually file that, hey, I should get 50% of your estate, because we've been living together for more than 5 years, and we've built a life together, and I've heard many have actually won those cases in court, because they were living together. They sort of just also put that into the bracket of, listen, you guys were basically building lives together, and so you owe each other 50% of the estate because of that. And so that's part of the confusion I'm also picking up. Have you had any exposure to that sort of thing, Fatan said specifically?
Yeah, that's always been a complication, particularly when there's more than one wife. If those wives don't know each other, and there's children from different families all over the country, and siblings, end up just, oh, I didn't realize I had another sister or another two brothers or something. So the complication around that law is that it's hard enough to determine who gets what when there's one wife. But then when there's a favored wife, another wife who's more favored somewhere else, and she gets more than another wife, or one wife gets cut out altogether. That's what is prompting the rewriting of the marriage laws in South Africa now. So they're in the process of rewriting all of those laws that have to do with inheritance. Because that's another huge grey area. So there's no clear law on that at the moment, and a lot of women are getting cut out and damaged in that process.
So Alan, I wanted to ask, with let's say counselors or pastors that, for example, are not familiar with all of this lobola and stuff was completely new for like foreigner like me, and coming in, and let's say a couple comes to you and they preparing to get married. What would be some of your advice to navigate this with a couple like that, if you're not familiar with some of these things?
Yeah, that's a key point. And one of the things that this research of mine really uncovered is that I found myself questioning people who presupposed that I believed that a customary marriage was not a legitimate marriage. And, the whole idea is, you guys, it's funny how people always say, you guys, you guys don't believe that a customary marriage is a legitimate marriage. And I would say, I do. I do believe it's a legitimate marriage. It's valid. It's legal, like we were saying just now. But what I discovered is that the locus of the argument should not be in whether or not a person is married. The locus of the argument should be on what that thing is. What is marriage?
Sure.
So we have a lot of people who are getting involved in customary marriages, and they, in effect, signing a contract, but they've never read the contract. So in premarital counseling, I'm at pains to help people to know what it is that they're actually signing. You're going to go into a customary marriage, and you might have a white wedding after that, and you should go to Home Affairs and register your marriage. But I want, as a pastor, as a theologian, I want you to understand what marriage is.
Yeah.
And that's huge, man. When I did huge study, I wrote 55,000 words just on marriage in this book.
Yeah.
So I went into that in detail, God's design for marriage in Genesis 1 and 2, and then how the fall affects it. So I'm at pains to define it rather than to determine whether or not a marriage is legitimate.
So while we are in the subject, because I've been asked this question, we were preparing a couple to get married, and they asked this question: what makes someone married?
Yeah.
And you get different answers to that. So how would you answer that?
Yes. And I think that's tied up also with the understanding that in a cultural marriage, there's no moment where a couple gets to say, I promise this to you, and the other one says, I promise this to you. There's no point So as you know, in a lobola negotiation, it's a common thing for a couple to, boy meets girl, and then they come together and they say, one says, I would like to marry you. The guy, gets presented to the girl's parents, and then once the guy has been presented to the girl's parents, then the family takes over and the couple takes a secondary position. Lobola is negotiated by the families. Sometimes the couple is allowed to be there outside the property or, within earshot, but not inside the room. So it's family, parents, uncles, aunts, just maybe distant family members who all have a stake will get together and they'll discuss it. So in that economy, in that way of doing things, the couple has very little say in what happens. It's almost as if once you've paid the lobola, you're married. There's no point at which they say, this is what marriage is. So for me, I want to insist that the church is brought into a relationship as early as possible. So, for example, now I'm doing premarital counseling with a couple, and the first time I realized there was something going on, they said to me, okay, we've paid lobola, and now we need premarital counseling. And I'm like, wait, we need to do this before you pay lobola. So the complication is that they don't want, the girl doesn't want her parents to meet the guy before she's ready to marry him. The parents don't want her to bring this guy, that guy, and all the guys home. They say, no, that's insulting to us. Just bring one guy home, marry this guy, and then we're done. So what we want to do is we want to try and involve the parents at an earlier stage before it becomes formal like that. So we can have normal discussions with parents about the process and whether the church believes that they should be married, because not all marriages should be made theologically, that are made in a customary way.
Sure.
So this book really argues for biblical counselors, for pastors, to encourage church members to first talk to the church, first talk to their elders, their pastors in the church, and say, hey, do you think it's wise that I marry this person? And without making this formal, we have an opportunity to discuss it and see if it's a wise thing, God-honoring thing. So we're just trying to preempt the whole process where someone comes and says, I've paid lobola, can we have premarital counseling? Because then it's a done deal, and a lot of our role is damaged.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. I think I veered off.
No. Look, I think it's very important. I think if you are a member of the local church, to because I think part of the issue is we because we're living in a world where there's, especially in South Africa, there's a lot of these cultural battles that are going on, and obviously with our history with with apartheid and black and white, there's even calling it a white wedding, there's almost this negative experience or mindset people have against, look, I'm just going to do a cultural wedding, and I'm not going to do the white wedding, and it's just because I don't want to do the white wedding because that's the white culture, and I'm going to do this cultural marriage because the black culture. And I think what they miss in all of that is the argument is not for what type of wedding ceremony you do, but it's when do you involve God in your not just your marriage but your wedding. Because if your marriage is an institution that has been created and given to us as a gift by God, surely we should involve Him in the process of the wedding. Yeah. And so if you do a customary marriage, hey, I'm so happy for you, but at what point did you involve the community to which you are covenanting with? And so even if you're not wearing a white gown and he's not wearing a suit and walking down an aisle and singing, playing dee 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 dee, that for me is not the big deal. I think the big deal for me is if you are connected to a local church and you have under shepherds who are caring for your soul, surely you want to have a not just a present godly representation, but even a visual godly representation who will pray your marriage at your wedding to God. And so whether that happens in your home after you guys have paid lobola, or whether it happens in a church after you guys have said I do, I think the point is there needs to be an involvement of the local church to which you are covenanting with as you are growing in your faith. And I think I've sort of picked up that wrestle of just the no white wedding, just lobola,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think I just realized while you were talking where I failed with Isaac's question, when is a couple married, considered married? And I think what I'm saying is that it's in a cultural wedding, if they never get the opportunity to say, I'm promising this to you and you promising this to me, I really believe that that's at the heart of when a couple is considered married, is when, like in a cultural sense, if they can look at each other in front of witnesses saying, I know what marriage is, marriage is this thing that God designed, a framework in which a man and a woman can be united as man and wife. And if you understand what that is, we're committing to that. That's at the heart of what marriage is. It's the commitment. And that's why it concerned me so much that in a cultural marriage, the couple takes a second place, and the family who are negotiating lobola takes the primary place, and then every member of the family must be included, and that couple almost gets to hear about what's going to happen. They decide on the date. I mean, obviously, we're generalizing, but the family decides on the date. The couple says, "Oh, okay, is it that day? Thank you. Let's do it." And the couple dances to the tune of the community more than they say, we're getting married on this day and we're inviting you. So a couple, I believe, biblically is considered married when they've made, I've argued for this extensively. If you read the book, you'll see when the couple makes a public commitment to one another in front of witnesses, and ideally church members, but you've got the three communities. You got the church, the cultural community, and the legal requirements. So we do require legal requirements because it's the law of the land, but we do consider a cultural marriage. On the issue of the white wedding, I asked a couple of people, I said, when you talk about a white wedding, are you talking about the wedding where the lady wears the white dress? Is it typically the white dress wedding, or is it the wedding in the way that white people do it?
Sure.
And I thought, there might be some leeway there, but they all insisted, yes, there's a white dress, but it's the way that white people get married in a church with commitments to each other, making vows to each other. And that's what they wanted. And then the other aspect of that is also that in an African cultural wedding, the bride is never put on display. In a white wedding, that's what appeals to a lot of ladies, African ladies who want a white wedding, is that it's the bride's day.
Yes.
She gets to be dressed up, she gets to be celebrated, and it's a wonderful day for a bride. Like my uncle once said, the groom is there to make it official.
Yes.
But it's a celebration of a beautiful bride.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's often missing in an African cultural wedding, that a number of the people that I've been involved with have wanted. They want that day because a man wants that day because it celebrates his beautiful bride. And a woman wants that because it makes her day special and memorable, rather than having an agreement made between family members and then the next day or the next week or whenever the celebration is arranged, they celebrate communally, but the couple is de-emphasized.
Sure.
The celebration is emphasized in the food and the partying, but the couple is sort of just wandering around, they're incidental. And I found that a lot of people wanted a white wedding because of that very thing. It doesn't emphasize the couple, doesn't emphasize the commitment they're making to each other, doesn't emphasize the fact that this is ordained by God, it's designed by God. So I realized that as church, as a church community, we need to make marriage the commitment to each other more deliberate and clear, and we need to celebrate the couple rather than just having them as two people in a crowd of sometimes strangers. When the whole community comes together, you don't even know who's there eating.
Yes.
I think it is very helpful, particularly what you spoke about witnesses, because just thinking about this and in a discussion with this couple that I was counseling, because God instituted marriage to the human race in this, it is, you'll find even in history, there was marriage, and it was somehow acknowledged, regardless if there was a white wedding or not. There was recognition from the community that these two people are in an exclusive
Yes.
relationship, that they and if something goes in between, that's not right. So we see throughout history, like the institution of marriage, even outside of, let's say, a Christian environment, because it was instituted by God, and that's some of the wrestling that were like, what makes it marriage? So that was partly why
Yes.
I was asking. So thank you. That's very helpful. I wanted to ask, what are some of the mistakes that maybe counselors or pastors do when navigating this journey on African marriages?
Yeah. Well, from a start, one of the things where I failed, and one of the reasons that pushed me into this research, is that I presumed when I was counseling a premarital African couple that they understood the cultural issues involved with marriage. So, for example, two African people from different languages, they each presume that the other understands their culture, and I, as a counselor, I think, well, these guys know what the cultural process is going to be.
Yeah.
But I discovered after a while, the one couple gave me this sort of gentle rebuke afterwards and said, you know what, you should have helped us to understand the church's perspective on all of the cultural issues that we were going to face in this marriage.
Sure.
So I should have asked each one of them, okay, what does your culture expect from you in this marriage? And then I should have said, from a theological perspective, what are the red lines that you shouldn't cross?
Sure.
So that poor couple, man, they blundered along, each getting battered by each other's families, not understand two different cultures,
Yeah.
And I should have done the job. I shouldn't have just presumed that they're African, so they understand the cultural issues involved. They were just as confused as I was.
Okay.
And so it was an encouragement for me as a pastor to care enough for a couple to say, okay, I mean, you guys might understand this, but help me to understand it and ask questions. And that helps me to be pre-prepared, having done all this research, be prepared what kinds of things to ask, which avenues to pursue in order to discover. And then I've clearly written red lines in this book, that you can read and you can say, okay, well, I'm going to be careful not to go there. But maybe in that regard, it's not just getting married that's an issue, that if the nature of marriage is a commitment to each other in public, then the other thing is, what about divorce? If a couple's in your church and they've had a cultural marriage, they've never legalized it at home affairs, and the husband is beating the wife, then what do we as a church say? Do we consider that a legitimate marriage? Is a divorce required? If it's permissible. I mean, doesn't have to happen, but it's permissible, not required, but permissible. Then how do we deal with that? How do we deal with a wife who can divorce a husband who's beating her or is committing adultery incessantly? Do we say, okay, she can divorce him, but what does a cultural divorce look like?
Sure.
In our experience, it tends to be that the couple or one of the spouses has to go back to their spouse's family and say, this guy's beating me. But then inevitably what happens is it ends up being a negotiation rather than a yes or no thing. It ends up being a negotiation. Okay, let's see, get a respected member of the community to try and talk to this guy. And from a church's perspective, we don't believe a marriage is viable in a particular case, but the community will take a different view. So in that case, that's something that we've stepped into as well, and it's been very complicated for us.
Wow.
Yeah, I could tell you stories, but no time.
So now many different pastors have a different take on this. So please feel as free as you want to. So in South Africa, we have what is very confusing in that because many pastors don't have marital licenses, you'll have a couple who will have the lobola months before the wedding. They'll sign weeks before the wedding, and then they get married. But in this process, they are still relating to one another. They're still dating. They still, as much as they are planning towards the wedding, they are still dating each other. If that makes any sense. The big issue then is, I've paid lobola here, I've signed here, and I'm going to go to the church here. If at any point after the lobola and before the church, we had sex, or we moved in together, would we be in sin? And I think that's sort of the big one is okay, if we've paid lobola, can we just move in together and just wait for the wedding? Or do we have to wait to sign, and after we've signed, can we then move in together, wait for the wedding? Or do we have to finish everything and then wait for the wedding? Or what would be your take on that?
Yeah. And I do think that technically that would be legitimate.
Okay.
If a couple lives together, because that whole sprawling process gets so complicated. But for us, what we do is we say to a couple, let's decide before this all happens, at what point you're going to consider yourself married. And we do that in conjunction with what the community would think. So, for example, if a couple goes to a lawyer and gets a marriage certificate, okay, now it's official, and then 2 weeks later they're going to have a wedding, would the community look at them and say, oh, this is scandalous, they're having sexual relations before the wedding ceremony? People, even if it's not wrong, the community develops, attaches a stigma to that type of thing. So we will say to each other, we'll say to the couple, at what point are you going to consider yourselves married? And then they'll say, okay, it's not when we sign the papers. We're not going to do that. It's not when we have the cultural wedding or whatever. They decide on a point at which they're going to consider themselves married. And that often has to do with their conscience. Would I feel guilty if I had sexual relations before the wedding ceremony?
Sure.
And even though it's legitimate because they're legally married, they would probably say, because we haven't exchanged vows in front of a community, they would probably, especially the elders, would probably consider this scandalous.
Sure.
So we'd say, okay, it's a conscience issue. If you think that somebody might have an issue with this, then just consider the date on this particular day. So in my experience and your experience, I'm sure, that young couples are always itchy to, to get going.
Yeah.
So a couple who can't wait, I'm always thinking to myself, well, this is a premarital counseling issue.
Sure.
A guy who can't wait, a girl who can't wait. It's a character issue rather than anything else.
Sure.
So I work hard with them to say, okay, on what date what's the big day?
Sure.
And then secondly, we try our utmost to try and get all of those dates as close together as possible. The date of a cultural wedding, you plan, if they're going to have a so-called white wedding, we try and plan that as soon, like in 1 week, try and get everything together as close as possible and coordinate it. So there's just 1 week in which they live in tension.
Sure.
But then we all agree, this is the date where we're going to consider you married, and then we celebrate.
Okay.
So, we try and see that coming. We try to alleviate that by deciding on a date and trying to squash things as close together as possible.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. So how then, maybe just talking about your book as we come to a close, do you have any plans of making it available? What sort of are you thinking around the book? You having it available as a resource? Is it available for purchase? If so, at how much is it currently going for?
Yeah. So this is unwieldy. You can tell it's just a lot of pages, and so it is available on Amazon at the moment. But I don't advise you buy the hard copy. The soft copy, the electronic version, Kindle version goes for about $12 at the moment.
Okay.
There's some pamphlets there I can give you, but it's an academic report, so it's not very fun reading. So at the moment I'm busy writing a series of about 10 smaller little books that are more accessible for the average guy
Okay.
in the church, based on the issues that are raised in this book.
Sure.
So this is really written for biblical counseling academics, guys who really are gluttons for punishment, and want to read the whole academic format,
Yes.
starting with, your declaration, your
Yes.
dedication, and,
Yes.
all the way through, research methodology and all of that. It's got an epistemology in it as well, which is a first in South Africa and in the world for biblical counseling.
Wow.
A well developed epistemology. So I mean, there's a lot of uniquenesses. It's a first, it's a seminal work. It's a first in its field.
Sure.
So it's available on Amazon or on my website, graceunlimited.co.za. And I'm not really trying to sell copies of this. It's really just claiming ownership of the intellectual, property. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan.
Sure.
And we'll put a link on that down in the description. But thank you for your research, and I think also just equipping other church members, counselors, pastors in navigating through this. And thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It's a nice surprise.
So we hope this was a helpful episode to you. And again, if it was, won't you please share it with those close with you? And like we always say, later.